Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, we're going to get this session going. Please do respect the session and the other attendees. Keep your talking and typing to a minimum. There'll be time for questions at the end. But in the meantime, let me introduce Patrick from Jamf, and he's going to talk to us about some OSX and some cyber espionage in the Middle East.
Awesome. Aloha and welcome to my talk, Cyber Espionage in the Middle East. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into an intriguing piece of Mac malware named WindTail. As mentioned, my name is Patrick. I am the creator of the Objective-C Mac security website and tool suite, previously a co-founder at Digita Security. We were recently acquired by Jamf, so now I am a Jamf employee. So today we're going to be talking pretty nerdily about OSX.WindTail. So first we will briefly discuss some background information, such as some previous research, and also briefly discuss the APT group responsible for creating the malware. After that, we'll then discuss WindTail's infection and exploitation vector, and then also talk about its persistent installation and, of course, its capabilities. And then we'll end by discussing some generic ways that we can detect this malware and its variants. All right, so let's dive in, starting with some background information. So we learned about WindTail from a presentation by Taha of Dark Matter. In his presentation, which was titled In the Trail of the WINDSHIFT APT, he talked about a new APT group called WINDSHIFT that was involved in extremely targeted attacks of a handful of individuals in both the government and infrastructure projects of a very specific certain Middle Eastern government. He also briefly discussed two of their Mac tools, including WindTail and another one called WindTape. So our talk today, we're going to build upon his research and provide a technical deep dive into the internals of the WindTail malware. Unit 42 of Palo Alto Labs also published a blog about the APT group and provided these nice graphics that kind of show a timeline of the activity. So in short, we can see that the WindShift APT group began their activity, or at least their activity was detected, in early 2017, and it continued well into 2018. So fairly recent. Now, today, as I mentioned, we're not really going to spend a ton of time talking about the APT group, as Taha really did a great job. So if you're interested kind of more about their group, motivations, and some attribution, I recommend checking out his presentation. Instead, as we noted, what we're going to do is dive in and tear apart WindShift's main macOS implant, WindTail. So let's start by first talking about its infection vector and how it is persistently installed. There was a first challenge, and that was actually to find a sample, because as far as I was aware, there wasn't a sample that was publicly made available for analysis. However, in Taha's talk, he provided a screenshot of a malicious email that was sent to one of the victims, and in this screenshot, there was a name of the malware, meeting_agenda.zip. Phil Stokes, noted security researcher, found that by searching for this name on VirusTotal, revealed a single file that matched this name exactly, which was detected, albeit by only 2 engines, as being malicious. I figured there's likely more variants or specimens of this malware, so we then used VirusTotal's similar to search keyword, and this found several new samples, many that had 0 signature-based detections at the time. They were all similarly named, as you can see on the slide, appearing to maybe masquerade as documents. And analysis confirmed that, yes, indeed, all these samples were actual WindTail samples. Although, as I mentioned, some were undetected at the time of this discovery. So today we'll be sticking with a specimen, a sample named final_presentation, but all the samples are essentially the same. So speaking of this final_presentation.zip, if we download and extract it and unzip it, it turns out it's a standard macOS application. It's also signed, although rather unsurprisingly, Apple has now revoked the certificate for the malware. And although the application is named final_presentation and has an icon that mimics a PowerPoint presentation, if we look at the apps bundle and look at the main executable, it is named user node. So the WINDSHIFT APT group used various methods to target and infect successfully Mac users in this Middle Eastern government. We saw in the previous slide from Taha's presentation that one way that they targeted and infected these Mac users was by simply sending an email with the malware attached. The goal or the idea was, since the malware had an icon that mimicked a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, certain naive users might fall for that and just click and run the malware directly and infect themselves. Now, that's really not that sophisticated and was likely rather unsuccessful. So the WINDSHIFT APT group also relied on a more sophisticated exploit, which to me is rather the most interesting aspect of both the APT group and I think of the malware. So here's a diagrammatic overview of the exploitation process. Basically, once a user is tricked into going to a malicious website, the website will automatically download a zip file, which is then automatically unzipped, and then this will launch an application via a custom URL scheme. So let's look a little closer at exactly how this all works and leads to the user ultimately being infected with the WindTail backdoor. So first, we should note that the exploit abuses several legitimate features of macOS. So there's no buffer overflows here. There's no memory corruption vulnerabilities. All just legitimate features that the attackers are leveraging to get code execution and install their malware. The main two legitimate features that they abuse are the fact that Safari auto-extracts certain files and that macOS will automatically register custom URL schemes. So by default, if you're browsing the web with Safari and a website downloads a zip file or you download a zip file manually, Safari will kindly auto-extract the zip file for you, which, that's not that bad per se. However, as we can see on the slide, when this happens, the unzipped application, finalpresentation.app, hits the file system, there is this daemon, the launch services daemon, or LSD, which can be seen parsing the application and updating a database file automatically. This is interesting, right? The user hasn't done anything at this point. They haven't clicked anything, simply gone to the website, and this zip file has been downloaded and auto-extracted. So let's look at this a little more. So if we take a peek at the malicious application, specifically we pull apart its app bundle and look at its info.plist file, we can see, as we can see on the slide, that there is a CF bundle URL types array, and within that there is a custom URL scheme, OpenURL 2622007. This is basically telling macOS, hey, I support a custom URL scheme, which, and this is important, macOS will automatically register. So via the lsregister command, this is a built-in utility in macOS, we can dump the system database, and we can see that the application, well, rather the malware, once it's hit the file system, this database now automatically creates an entry that maps the malware to this custom URL scheme. But again, I want to stress this happens automatically as soon as the app hits the file system. Again, no user interaction involved at this point. Now, once the malware has been registered as a handler for this custom URL scheme, it can now be launched via any request for this custom URL scheme because macOS now has associated it with that scheme. For example, from JavaScript within a browser. So here's some example code that realizes the exploit. Now, I never had access to the APT group's actual exploit code, but it's very easy for us to recreate similar code that will trigger these features or vulnerabilities. So we can see it's a malicious website, not too fancy, and the first thing it does is it auto-downloads a zip containing a malicious application. And as we mentioned, Safari, by default, will extract this zip archive. Now, this means there's an application sitting on the file system. macOS notices this and parses the application, and because it broadcasts or says it supports a custom URL scheme, macOS will automatically register it. Once this has happened, the web page via JavaScript will make a request to launch or open this app via the custom URL scheme. Now, if the user clicks allow on the displayed pop-ups, the malware will be executed and the user will be fully infected. So here's a demo of the example exploit. We can see it's first going to download the zip file automatically and extract it, and then launch that because it's been registered. Now, there is a pop-up, but if the user clicks OK on this, we can now see that the malware has been persistently infected and the system is fully compromised. So how does the malware persist once it's been executed or launched via this exploit vector? Well, if we disassemble the malware's main function, we can see that the first action it takes is invoking functions associated with creating a login item. Specifically, it calls the ls shared file list create API and the ls shared file list insert item URL. Now, once a login item is created on macOS and points to the malicious application, anytime the user logs in, macOS will automatically re-execute the malware. Now, this isn't the most stealthiest of persistence mechanisms, right? You can open the system preference pane and go and click on a button that says login items, and you will see the login item persisted. But the average user is not going to be poking around. So this technique suffices. Now, once the malware has been persisted, it then installs itself by invoking a method named CP for, well, copy. If we debug this method, right, we attach the debugger and start stepping through, we can see the malware will copy itself from the download directory, where the exploit downloaded it to, into the user's library directory. Now, if we run a process monitor, we can passively observe this, as we can see on the slide. We can use one, for example, fsusage, which is a built-in file monitoring utility that's directly embedded in macOS. Now, the installed malware doesn't really blend in, right? You can see on the slide, if you actually go and look at your library directory and you're infected, there'll be this orange PowerPoint-looking presentation icon sitting there amongst all these other system directories and folders. But again, the average user is not going to be poking around in here. So it's likely that it won't be discovered. Now, the malware has been copied into the user's library directory. The original instance, the one that was downloaded and executed by the exploit, will then execute this copy via the open command. Again, we can observe this via a process monitor. We can see the first instance kicking off or launching the second instance. Now, when the malware is launched, again, the main function will be executed. And if you recall, what happens in the main function? It persists itself. So this actually means that the malware will persist itself twice, as we can see on the slide. So now if you go into the system preference pane again and look at the login items, you will see two entries for the malware. One for the copy that was downloaded and one for the copy that has been persistently installed in the user's library directory. Now, I'm not sure if this is a bug or if the attackers really wanted to make sure that the malware gets persisted. But obviously, they only had to actually persist the second installed instance. Okay, so now we understand how WindTail gets onto users' systems, and also then how it persistently installs itself to ensure that every time the user re-logs in, the malware will be automatically re-executed by macOS. So now let's take a look at its capabilities. First, though, we have to talk about the malware's string encryption, as the malware contains many encrypted strings embedded directly in the binary. Now, of course, if we can somehow decrypt the embedded strings, analysis, our understanding of the malware and its capabilities will be much easier, because likely the strings that are encrypted are related to what it does, how it functions. So if we look at the malware's decompiled code, we can see a method named yan that invokes something named yoop. This method first decodes a string and then calls into an AES decryption routine that decrypts a string with a hard-coded key. This means we now know the encryption algorithm, and also because it's a hard-coded key that's directly embedded in the malware's binary, we have access to the decryption key. Now, I'm a bit lazy. I didn't feel like re-implementing an AES decryption routine or even finding some Python code that did that, even though we had the string, or rather the key. So instead, I said, let's find a way to coerce the malware to simply decrypt the strings for us, right? Work smart, not hard. So instead, what we can do is we can coerce the malware to always load our library, and then code within this library can dynamically print out these strings as they are decrypted at runtime. So again, the idea is to let the malware do the hard work, the decryption for us. So let's look a little closer about how to accomplish this. So once our dynamic library has been loaded into the address space of the malware, what we can do is we can swizzle or swap out the malware's decryption routine, again, it's called yoop, with our own. And this is accomplished via the rather powerful API, method exchange implementation. As we can see on the slide, once the decryption function has been swizzled or swapped, anytime the malware invokes the decryption method, transparently the Objective-C runtime will actually now call our method in our library. So what our method simply does is first calls through to the malware's original decryption library, passing in the string argument that was passed in, and then when that returns, we have access to the decrypted string. So what I did was I simply added a debug message to this, to our library, so that now whenever the backdoor is executed, for example, in our lab or on a VM, we can watch this decryption happen at runtime. And it's easy now to see some of the strings that pop up. Seems like they're strings related to the malware's installation, location, perhaps some file extensions, and then also the command and control servers. Again, these were embedded in the binary, but encrypted. Now we have access to the decrypted strings. Now, as we just saw, many of the strings are encrypted rather, and some of these appear to look like file extensions, right? Turns out what WindTail does is scan the entire infected system, the entire hard drive, and for any file that matches on these file extensions, it then creates a zip file in /temp with the contents of that file, and then exfiltrates that zip file via macOS's built-in curl utility. So this is a fairly comprehensive file exfiltration capability, and it really appears to be the main goal of the malware. Now, this makes a lot of sense. This is rather unsurprising, as it's a piece of malware that's used in very targeted cyber espionage campaigns. So again, it makes sense the attackers, once they get onto a new Mac system, would want to gather up all the files that match these file extensions that likely have very interesting information and exfiltrate that out to their command and control servers. Now, I'm a big fan of writing custom command and control servers to facilitate analysis, so I wrote one to talk to WindTail. So we can now use this custom command and control server to confirm WindTail's capabilities, for example, its file exfiltration behavior. So here's a demo of this custom command and control server, and we can see it's receiving files from the malware. On the right, we can see the incoming post requests. This is the malware posting the zip files via the curl utility. And then on the left, we simply save them out to the file system. So again, this allows us to task the malware and confirm, yes, it is scanning the entire file system and exfiltrating files that match those decrypted file extensions. WindTail also supports file download. If we look at the SDF method, we can see it decrypts the address of an embedded command and control server, and then makes an initial request to this command and control server to get a name for the downloaded file. Then a second request is made to the command and control server to download the actual file off the attacker's command and control server. And if we run a network monitor, for example, in our VM, we can observe these two requests. The malware will then execute this downloaded file. So if you look at more of the disassembly in the SDF method, we can see it unzips this downloaded file into the user's directory via the built-in ditto command, which is kind of interesting, and then executes it via the NSTask API. Via a process monitor, we can passively observe this download and execute in action. Again, though, let's confirm this via a custom command and control server. When the malware beacons out, let's have it download and execute the ubiquitous calculator app. So we can see this in action. It's going to reach out, download, and then launch the malware application, or the calculator application that was pulled from our command and control server. Obviously, armed with the ability to remotely download and execute other files, this gives the attackers the remote capability to download and run other tools, or even perhaps install another piece of malware, maybe a second stage implant or backdoor. Finally, the backdoor can also be remotely uninstalled by some embedded self-delete logic. So every time the malware starts up, it connects out to the command and control server and makes a request to a certain API endpoint. If the response from the server from this API is a 1, this tells the malware to self-delete. So the malware will first uninstall itself and then terminate. Having a remote self-delete capability is a neat feature, as it allows an attacker to remotely disinfect systems. Perhaps if the malware is detected elsewhere, they notice there's an AV signature that pops up for it, or perhaps when they are done with the target. So a demo again via the custom command and control server. It's going to show WindTail responding to the self-delete command. And note the persistently installed implant. Again, it's that fairly obvious orange icon in the library folder is going to disappear. And of course, once the malware has self-deleted, it'll stop beaconing because it's been completely removed from the system. All right, so let's end by briefly talking about some runtime detections that will allow us to generically detect the malware. So the first thing we want to be able to generically detect is the exploitation attempt, the initial infection vector. And we can do this by observing a few rather anomalous activities. So first, observing that Safari auto-downloads and extracts an application is something of note. Then that same application is triggers the registration of a custom URL handler. And then finally, that same application, which was just auto-downloaded and auto-registered, is then launched again via Safari. So we can detect the combination of these events, and cumulatively then, this gives us a very powerful detection capability, both for detecting WindTail and its variants, but also any other malware, for example, copycat malware, that makes use of this same exploit or infection vector. We can also detect WindTail when it goes to persist itself. So recall that WindTail persists itself as a login item, pointing to an application in the user's library directory. That's somewhat strange, that's somewhat odd. Now, this isn't documented by Apple, but on recent versions of macOS, login items are saved or persisted by Apple's background task management agent. And it does this by writing them out to a background.items file. So what we can do is if we have file monitoring capabilities on that system, for example, built into a security product, we can simply monitor for the background items files being monitored or changed, and then we can parse out the changes and detect any time a new login item has been added. Here's an example of detecting and alerting on the malware's persistence. And actually, this alert was generated with no a priori knowledge of the malware per se. It was simply monitoring for the creation of new login items. Now, if you're interested in the technical details of detecting login item persistence, I wrote a recent blog post that comprehensively covers the topic. Goes a little more into this background agent that registers the login items, and then also into the file format of the login items file, because you have to do some parsing once you detect a change and extract what was added and pull out relevant information, for example, the path to the application that was persisted as a login item. So if that's of interest to you, check out the blog. Now, imagine that WindTail has already been installed. Maybe you're worried that a system is already infected. Well, it turns out there are some runtime behaviors that we may be able to leverage to detect WindTail by kind of making the observation that it does some rather anomalous stuff. So, for example, perhaps it's strange, I think it is, that a persistent login item is accessing all of the files on your file system, zipping up a large number of those, and then exfil those out to a remote server. So what we can do is we can monitor the file system for that kind of activity. Again, tracking back these file accesses to the login item, perhaps keeping track or account of how many files it accesses and what it does with them. Perhaps we can also monitor for process launches. It's pretty easy to do. And if, for example, we see curl, we can examine the arguments. It's fairly rare to see curl being automatically executed with post parameters telling curl to essentially exfiltrate and post a file to a remote command and control server. Or perhaps we can just detect unauthorized network action. Now, of course, we don't have to trigger only when all of these events are cumulatively observed. One or two may warrant a closer look at the binary or system as a whole. But this, again, will allow us to generically detect WindTail or even other types of malware that are doing such file collection and exfiltration. Okay, so that's a wrap. Today we comprehensively discussed WindTail from its initial infection vector, how it exploited systems to gain access. We talked about its persistence, its capabilities, and discussed some ideas for generic detection. On a personal note, I want to say thanks to Jamf and also the Virus Bulletin Conference for hosting my talk, and also to the myriad of companies that support my Objective-C work and my open source Mac security tools. And one more thing, if you are interested in Mac security topics, I'd love to see you at Objective by the Sea. It's the Mac security conference I organize. It's going to be happening in early March in Hawaii. So, great opportunity for your work to send you to Hawaii. All right, so again, thank you for attending my talk. I think we have 3 or 4 minutes for some questions. And again, thank you to Virus Bulletin for putting on this amazing event. I also should note that these WindTail samples are available on Objective-C. There's a comprehensive malware collection. So if you want to download the sample, play around with it, kind of work through these slides, you can do that as well.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. That was a wonderful presentation.